Kissinger at 100, how his sordid diplomacy in Africa fueled war in Angola and prolonged apartheid. What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. My name's Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, out here in Budapest, Hungary on December 1st, 2023, recording this video for y'all. It's been a very interesting year. We've had a lot of tragedies. The war in Ukraine is continuing. There have been earthquakes in Turkey and Morocco. Israel and Palestine are going head to head. But at least we can end this year with some sort of triumph. We got him. We got him. Henry Kissinger has finally left the planet Earth. He is a war criminal. He is Satan incarnate, and the devil has finally called him home. For anybody who doesn't know who Henry Kissinger is, brief summary: he's Emperor Palpatine. You know, George Lucas made Star Wars based on Henry Kissinger. Emperor Palpatine is evil incarnate, the ultimate Sith Lord, and Henry Kissinger is just the real life example of that, even though he is much worse. He was the architect behind the carpet bombing in Cambodia. He toppled democratically elected leaders in Latin America. He has been behind almost every U.S. president's evil foreign policy decisions. He is a bad, bad, bad man. Bad man. You know, if you looked behind his coat, behind the back of his jacket, a little tail whipped out, but he often hid it. You couldn't find it. So we're glad Henry Kissinger is off this planet. Rest in piss, you evil piece of shit. But you know what? I don't get caught up in other people's foreign policy problems. You guys know how I feel about Israel, Palestine, and all of that. But we are going to talk about Kissinger's involvement in Black Africa and how he was an anti-Black racist, which is even worse. Even worse. It's the worst thing to be on the planet, to be an anti-Black racist. So what we're going to do is read this article here in the Guardian. I have the link to the article in the description, and check this video out. Let's go. Historians say the involvement in Africa of the former U.S. Secretary of State, who is 100 this week. This article was written back in May, but we know Henry Kissinger died 2 days ago, so thank God. Uh, who is 100 this week, drew the U.S. into Angola's war and aided apartheid after the Soweto uprising. This was written by Peter Beaumont for The Guardian on May 25th, 2023. The men who sat down for dinner at the Hotel Bodemais in West Germany on June 23rd, 1976, were exclusively white, although the issue to be discussed was the path to majority black rule in Rhodesia. At the table was John Vorster, Prime Minister of Apartheid South Africa. With him were ambassadors, diplomats, and security officials. Pride of place, however, was reserved for the U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who opened the proceedings with a racially tinged joke. It was a dinner that took place in the midst of a frantic 2 year period when the world's most high profile diplomat, who had dismissively ignored Africa for much of his time in office in the Nixon and Ford administrations, was taken with a sudden interest in the continent. Then, armed with a dangerous Cold War logic, he applied himself to successive crises in Ethiopia, Angola, and Rhodesia in the search of a quick fix to burnish a reputation that was beginning to be eclipsed. As Kissinger turns 100 on May 27th, though now he is resting in eternal damnation, his interventions in Africa have once again come under the spotlight, not only for the multiple failures that emerged from an approach befogged by deception, secrecy, and browbeating, but for the long lasting and dangerous consequences of his efforts in Southern Africa in particular. So, this is a picture here. Pupils used the Regina Mundi Church as a refuge during the student uprising on June 16th, 1976, in Soweto, South Africa. Just a little brief bit of history. Soweto was like a ghetto in Johannesburg, South Africa. That was the crux. It was like the, how can I say this? In American context, it was like the Alabama, like the Montgomery, Alabama. Like the roots of the civil rights movement in the U.S. are in Montgomery, Alabama. In South Africa, the roots of their struggle against racial apartheid ties to Soweto mostly, because that's where the most activity was going on. And of course, students were often involved in the protests and that sort of thing. I want to jump back to the beginning of the story with a bunch of white men sitting around the table talking about how to divide Africa or how things are going to go in Africa. That's how Africa was carved up during the scramble for Africa during the colonial period back in the 17 and 1800s and the 1900s and that sort of thing. And also that is what continues now in the present day with neocolonialism still happening. And Henry Kissinger alone in this group, in this room full of white men. Henry Kissinger is Jewish, by the way. Not that that matters much to how he views the world, but I'll say this. In that room full of white, waspy men, Henry Kissinger fit right in, and he had no problem using racially insensitive language and jokes against black people, even though the same people he was probably sitting down with had negative things to say about Jews. But this is the thing: Jewish people cannot claim to be white on one side and then Jewish on the other, because guess what? Guess what? They are mostly white. Most of the Jews are white passing, and they can fall into those rooms and make those evil racist jokes about black people and be anti-black racist, just like Henry Kissinger was. And yes, you are an anti-black racist if you're sitting down with the presidents of apartheid South Africa and apartheid Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Going to continue here. In the space of a handful of years, Kissinger would be involved in a murky intervention in Angola that would complicate the emerging conflict there that followed Portugal's withdrawal after a coup in Lisbon. So, continuing, he became the first US Secretary of State to visit South Africa in 3 decades, delivering prestige to the apartheid regime in the aftermath of the Soweto massacre in 1976, when scores of demonstrating school children and others were gunned down by police. That's a horrible thing to do. The US government basically was supporting South Africa because they were anti-communist back in the late 1900s, last century, right? Basically, the world was divided between communist states that were aligned with the Soviet Union and free first world states that were aligned with the U.S. And South Africa was aligned with the US, but they had an evil racist apartheid system that was partially inspired by the apartheid in the US. And the US was okay with that, just as long as they weren't communists. This is the thing: Henry Kissinger was involved in overthrowing democratically elected leaders like the ones in Chile, Salvador Allende, and others in Latin America, just because they were not okay with the status quo of the US. So they were okay with opening their borders and their diplomatic missions to the Soviet Union and doing trade with communist countries and that sort of stuff. That was unacceptable to Henry Kissinger and people of his ilk. So they decided, you know what they need? They need a dictator. They need somebody who's anti-communist. They need somebody like Augusto Pinochet. Augusto Pinochet was the dictator of Chile who ended up killing thousands of his own citizens just because they were communist. And we, the United States, with the leadership of guys like Henry Kissinger, Nixon, and all the other presidents afterwards, said the number one thing we can't have are communists in power. So we'll deal with racist South Africa. We'll deal with dictators in Latin America. We can carpet bomb Cambodia just as long as they are not communists in those countries. It's sick. We should have never given legitimacy to South Africa by sending diplomats there, and Henry Kissinger should have passed away long time ago. But I will continue. And while he would strong arm Rhodesia's pariah prime minister Ian Smith into making a declaration that he would accept majority black rule, it would be a failed initiative undertaken in questionable faith and underpinned by his own sympathies for the white minority communities who were ruling Rhodesia and South Africa with racist policies. The consequences, as historians point out, were a hugely prolonged war in Angola and an added lease of life for apartheid. So basically, once again, he, told the Rhodesian president, and by the way, Rhodesia is this place right here, which is now Zimbabwe today. Rhodesia was also an apartheid state ruled by a small number of the whites who were in the country. And Kissinger went down there, twisted the Rhodesian president's arm, and said, listen, you got to accept black majority rule. But deep down inside, Kissinger was sympathetic to white majority rule. He was okay with white people running these mostly black, entirely black nations of South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Zambia, all these places. And this is Kissinger's plan. And he was okay with a civil war continuing in Angola and that sort of stuff. Let's continue reading here. In a scathing memoir written for American Diplomacy in 2010, the former U.S. ambassador to Nigeria, Donald Esom, who served as the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, delivered a withering assessment of Kissinger, describing African ambassadors and representatives at the UN as routinely rebuffed and neglected by the Secretary of State's office and his disdain for Black Africa. Kissinger would become engaged by events in Angola, where after a left-wing military coup in 1974 against Lisbon's Estado Novo dictatorship, the new regime immediately stopped all military action in the African colony, leading to independence in 1975. concerned that the Marxist Leninist People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or MPLA, one of the combatants in the civil war that followed the coup, would sweep to power, opening the way for Soviet influence. Kissinger moved to engage with Africa. In his memoir, Esom summarized Kissinger's ambition. He was determined to seize in Angola what he considered a timely opportunity to display America's and Henry Kissinger's strength. He believed that defeating the MPLA, which he considered pro Soviet, could expunge the image of a flabby United States in retreat after Vietnam. Moreover, he thought he could do it on the cheap with clandestine CIA collaboration. He was soon to be proved dead wrong. So Henry Kissinger was so disheartened that America lost the Vietnam War. Yes, the Vietnamese beat our red, white, and blue asses. That you know what America needs to do? We need to show our strength. We need to show our power. We need to show our might. We need to overthrow some other revolutionaries in another country who are trying to get rid of a colonial master. Listen, Portugal was under a dictatorship at the end of the 20th century that was a fascist regime. And Portugal also had colonies in Africa like Mozambique, like Angola, Sao Tome, and Principe and other places like that. And they were ruling over these black people with an iron fist. And these black people decided that they wanted freedom. They wanted liberation. They wanted the ability to run their own country and have their own state and not be run by fascist dictators. To guys like Kissinger, oh no, 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 that is absolutely wrong. Can't do that. You can't have your own country, black people. You can't be having self determination. That's not cool for y'all. If you're going to be flying communist banners, who knows? You might try to liberate your people. You might try to make sure that everybody has a living wage and free health care and all that sort of stuff. That is unacceptable in the world order led by America. We can't have that. No communism allowed. So we got to overthrow your leaders. We got to send the CIA in. We got to send in the economic hitmen, stuff that Henry Kissinger was all about. So, this is a quote here. He didn't study Africa. He went in with a very typical racism of the time, a contempt for all the developing countries. Nancy Mitchell, historian. Let's continue here. So, if Angola was important, not least after the Cuban intervention to support the MPLA after South Africa invaded and its forces drove almost to the capital, Luanda, it was because Kissinger believed that should Angola fall, neighboring states could follow, including Rhodesia, ultimately threatening South Africa. He had a reputation for being a strategic genius, says Nancy Mitchell, a historian and author of Jimmy Carter in Africa, Race and the Cold War. But if you study what Kissinger did in Angola and Rhodesia, it really sheds a light on the weakness of his entire policy in Africa, but also in the Middle East and Vietnam. He misread the situation in Angola from the start. He never expected the Cubans to intervene. Shout out to Cuba, by the way, for going out and supporting revolutionary movements like, yeah, they sent soldiers to Africa to fight against dictatorships and fascist colonial regimes. Shout out to Cuba. They might revoke my citizenship for that, but I don't care. Cuba back in the day was hard body. Hard body. They were out there rocking with all the revolutionaries. Shout out to Fidel. Shout out to Shay. Shout out to Fidel and Shay. Shout out to them boys, man, because they were out there fighting for the people heavy, heavy. And guys like Kissinger saw them as enemies. So this is Kissinger with Tanzania's President Julius Nyerere in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania in April 1976. Shout out to Julius Nyerere. When I went to Tanzania, one of the funniest moments in my life was talking to the Tanzanian people about their first president, because Julius Nyerere is like their George Washington, like their national hero. He's the guy that got their independence. And the thing about Tanzania, they didn't fight a war against the colonial powers. One of the funniest things that a Tanzanian ever told me is that, you know, Julius Nyerere, he was good with the white people. He was able to talk to them and convince them just to leave. That was the funniest thing I ever heard. Yeah, basically, Julius Nyerere was known as a charismatic leader who was able to, you know, persuade the white powers that were dominating Africa and still dominate Africa to this day that Tanzania will be a safe partner. They're not going to become communists or socialists, even though Julius Nyerere did have some left wing leanings, and that's why Tanzania has sort of like a socialist economy and country today to some degree. But yeah, Julius Nyerere was very convincing to guys like Kissinger that he would not be a threat, which is why I think Kissinger left him alone. Kissinger could have easily called in the CIA or had agents come in and assassinate Julius Nyerere like he did with other democratically elected leaders. But you know what? He backed off because Julius Nyerere had the gift of gab, that power of the tongue. Let's go. So, echoing Esom, Mitchell sees the period of Kissinger's diplomacy in Africa as very sordid and damaging, not least his whirlwind tour of African leaders in 1976, which saw him fleetingly meet Tanzania's Julius Nyerere and Zambia's Kenneth Kaunda, among others, leaving behind a legacy of distrust. He really dismissed the whole continent of Africa until he thought he could get a reputational gain by intervening in Angola and saving it for American influence. He didn't study Africa. He went in with a very typical racism of the time, a contempt for all developing countries, and thought he could get an easy victory, which he needed after the collapse of South Vietnam, said Mitchell. He even said it about himself when he quipped to a British foreign official that it was a mixture of extreme arrogance and naivete. So he even knew himself that, you need to study Africa and pay attention to what's happening in Africa. But as a white man born in the middle of the 20th century, when, anti black racism was still very much alive and well and front and center, he probably thought, Africa is something that we can easily dominate. We can easily just bring colonialism back. We can easily just topple their leaders or put money in their face to sway them our way or that sort of thing. Or we can destabilize the region and everything will be fine, but it didn't work out that way. So it's saying in the text. Let's continue. As Mitchell points out, while Kissinger spent hours in talks with Rhodesia's and South Africa's white leaders on his whistle stop tour of black leaders, he either failed to meet key players such as Samora Machel in Mozambique, was unaware of the importance of others, including Robert Mugabe, whose ZANU PF forces were threatening the white regime in Rhodesia, or spent a mere 7 minutes with Joshua Nkomo, Mugabe's chief rival. So the consequence was that the leaders of the frontline states, who Kissinger needed to persuade to buy into his plan for majority rule in Rhodesia, were either unimpressed or deeply distrustful, undermining his efforts from the start. There was another issue: Kissinger's innate sympathies with white minority rule, seen through the Eurocentric prism. As Peter Vale, a historian at the University of Pretoria, wrote in a recent essay for The Conversation, where he described Kissinger's record in Africa as dismal and said he neither ended colonialism nor minority rule in the region. He wrote, Kissinger's interest in Southern Africa in the mid 1970s was predicated on the idea that balance would return if the interests of the strong were restored. He failed to understand that the struggle for justice was changing the world and diplomacy itself. So Kissinger was more interested in making sure that American hegemony was powerful, that Western domination of Africa was still powerful, not that liberation and freedom for the African people would be realized. He was not there for that. He just wanted to make sure that the status quo was maintained of black people being dominated by more powerful European forces. So, speaking to The Guardian, Vale described the meeting at the Hotel Bodemont and what it portended. The conference was a bunch of white men sitting in Germany. He saw Africa in terms of Europe and as a subtext of European diplomacy. So, with Zambia's president Kenneth Kaunda in Lusaka, Zambia in September 1976. All right. I wonder why there's no pictures of Henry Kissinger even shaking hands. Did he even shake hands? He didn't shake any hands. He didn't shake Julius Nyerere's hand. They ain't got no pictures of that. I wonder why. I wonder why. I'm joking. I'm joking. So that was perhaps nowhere more obvious than in his visit to South Africa, where he persuaded a tearful Ian Smith in town for a rugby match to agree to majority rule. As Vale points out, he met only one black South African figure who was critical of apartheid. His visit, he says, was the high point of apartheid's diplomacy. What were the harms? Vale asks. He suggests the visit to South Africa probably extended the life of the apartheid regime, while contributing to a significant military mobilization around Angola, which South African forces would invade again in 1987, leading to the battle and siege of Koito Kouanaval. So, yeah, he said that he went there and persuaded the president of South Africa to accept that black people could rule over South Africa in the majority. But that didn't actually happen until many years later. Didn't actually happen until many years later. So he wasn't actually putting the pressure on them. He was just putting lip service to it. Kissinger went there and said, "Hey guys, you got to accept this. This eventually has to happen." But they didn't do it. In fact, they probably felt even more legitimized because the frickin' US Secretary of State is coming there and talking to them directly. The third most powerful man or the third most influential man in the federal government is coming here meeting with y'all directly saying, hey, could y'all maybe please stop that? But yet and still they continued with it. And there was no extreme pressure to put on them to do it. Because listen, they were more scared of guys like Nelson Mandela, who possibly could be socialist or communist, rather than the apartheid regime that was maintaining the status quo. Let's continue here. So, what were the harms? Vale asks. He suggests the visit to South Africa probably extended the life of the apartheid regime. And we'll stop right there. Let's go to the next paragraph. Nancy Mitchell agrees. I think it is very plausible that Kissinger's diplomacy in Africa gave apartheid more years, she says. Since it was felt that Mozambique was also going, the idea was to have a white buffer. It was felt it was felt important for white South Africa to stay stable because of trade in minerals. Much of it was a deliberate attempt to buttress South Africa. Perhaps the last word should be left for the late Donald Esom, whose memorandums and those of many other seasoned colleagues in the State Department Africa Bureau Kissinger ignored. It is impossible to know what might have resulted had Kissinger accepted the policy stances toward Angola of the first two African Bureau Assistant Secretaries he hired. It is in any case difficult to imagine that their recommendations would have resulted in the kind of nightmare for Angolans, for U.S. prestige, and for himself that his bludgeoning of the bureaucracy provoked. As Esom notes, sadly, it would take until 2002 for peace to come to that war racked, landmine strewn nation. So basically, yeah, what they were trying to do, Kissinger was basically fueling, putting fire on the Angolan Civil War, which lasted for many decades, even like a decade past the end of the Cold War. So millions of Angolans got displaced or died in this civil war, and Kissinger was fine for that, just as long as it maintained the status quo and it didn't disrupt America's hegemony on Africa or the West hegemony on Africa. Let's continue here. So that's the end of the article. So once again, rotten piss, Henry Kissinger. You will not be missed. Hopefully, the world is a more safe and stable place. But the sad thing is that his legacy probably lives on through other people who are training to become diplomats in the future or statesmen in the future, and probably his ideas about realpolitik and the use of American force to bend the world to America's will probably continue in the future. But we can fight against that. We can resist that as long as people speak up and we are critical of men like Henry Kissinger. My name is Simon Hill. Thank you for watching. Peace.